Hello, my name is Steve D'Agostino, and my co-host Anne Fernald and I welcome you to the Twice Over podcast, because to teach is to learn twice over. In this episode, Invitations to Innovation, we are joined by Sharif Mowlabocus, who shares his thoughts about how to reimagine structures as a way to foster creativity and change.
Welcome to the Twice Over podcast, and I'm so delighted to be welcoming Sharif Mowlabocus, who's Associate Chair of Communication and Media Studies at Lincoln Center, and my colleague, to talk to us about innovation, which is our theme for this year. So I'm really happy that we get to talk together today. So welcome to the podcast, Sharif.
Thank you so much. But it's wonderful to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast and everything that you and Steve have been doing for all instructors.
The question that I wanted to ask you about has to do with the reading and talking that we did around what makes faculty development meaningful for institutions. You know, when you were thinking about what a teaching and learning center should be at Fordham, did anything emerge for you as really innovative, really exciting? When you think about what helps make faculty development have an impact, be effective, what are you most excited about?
I have to say that the pandemic was horrific and terrible in many, many different ways. But I think, as we see in so many different industries, it offered the potential. You know, it afforded the opportunity for revisioning and for experimentation and for shaking things up. When I think about innovation, I think we have a finite window at the moment where there is still that flexibility, I suppose. I think we have to seize this opportunity. In terms of what excites me, we all went through this. Adjunct instructors went through this, tenure line faculty went through this, administrators went through this. So we were all there together. And I think that's actually really important, because a lot of the time when we think about teaching and learning innovation, it's something that happens in an almost a siloed way, right? You know, it's like, oh, we are facing an increase in students, so let's think about how we might deliver content, how we might deliver teaching differently. Or we might be facing something around an increase in students or something, you know, it's like, how does Res Life react to that? Well, the pandemic created a situation where everyone had to react. We all were in that same boat. And so I think that for me, the exciting thing about right now and the potential for innovation is that we might not all be coming to this from the same perspective, as it were, you know, but we all have an investment and a recognition that something has happened and that it's actually revealed an opportunity for change, which in a very long-winded way is getting me to my first kind of key thing. Is what excites me is that I think everyone from the top down is interested in, has a motivation for, can see the real reasons, not only why we must innovate, but the opportunities for innovation as well. That really excites me. And so I'm thinking not only about what's happening in the classroom, but I also think there's opportunities for us to think about scheduling, for instance. You know, scheduling,
can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, during the pandemic, we couldn't do anything in spring 2020. I think everyone fully agrees that just getting through spring 2020 with, you know, and managing to teach anything was a miracle. But as soon as we realized in our department that this is going to be ongoing, that we're likely going to be looking at the very least, some kind of hybrid teaching. So we looked at where we could make efficiencies. We still need to deliver the same courses. We still need to deliver the same number of sections of courses. But we started to encourage faculty to think, not force them, but we encourage them to think about, okay, maybe I can create efficiencies in my teaching schedule. So maybe actually I will teach 2 sections of this one course rather than one section of 3 courses. Just simple things like that actually, when I came into the department, I was finding people were teaching 3 different classes in a semester, but there were multiple sections of those classes and they were just teaching one of them. And I come from a background where actually we try and double up and sometimes triple up on sections, because one class prep does you for 3 sections. It doesn't reduce the amount of grading you have to do, but it drastically reduces the amount of prep that you need to do. So that was one of the first things that we looked at. The second thing, in the Department of Communication and Media Studies, we have long had a flexibility about double blocks. So some of our production classes just don't work in 75-minute blocks. They actually need twice the amount. So they'll meet once a week, but for twice the amount of time. The schedule offers those opportunities already, but we liaise with deans in FCRH and FCLC to create more of those. There's a certain balancing act you have to do there, but that also meant that faculty could deliver content in different ways. And again, it also freed them up a little bit. They were still having the same amount of contact time with students, but they could actually get through the same amount of stuff, but get it done in kind of like one block, as it were. For me, what really excites me is that Fordham is at a place at the moment where it has the opportunity to revisit how scheduling is organized. And I think that's actually really important, because we can do great things in the classroom and outside the classroom and around the classroom. But if we can have a flexibility in when we teach, what modality we teach in, exactly what we're teaching, I think if there's a flexibility around that, around the administrative side of things, then I think that actually it helps us to bring some of these other ideas about kind of the core of teaching and learning. It helps to make those more robust, and it fits with the 21st century as well. That's the other thing. I don't know the last time we changed the scheduling practices at Fordham, but sometimes we do just need to switch those things up because our students need something different.
I'm glad you started with scheduling, because when we use words like innovation, we think of a radical reconceptualization, right? Something really new, I think, rather than it's in a model of discovery and transformation rather than a model of interrogation of past practices, right? Okay, this is what we always did. Why did we do it? The conditions around that past practice, or the conditions that past practice was meant to address, have changed. And so you mentioned earlier, one of the impediments to change or transformation or innovation is really a kind of conservatism, right? The way we always did it was a good way. These are the reasons why it was a good way. To change that way will result in these unforeseen consequences. And then to make a change, there are associated costs. Getting over the cultural hurdles, but then there are other, perhaps technological, financial, political impediments that prevent that from happening. And so I like the idea of starting with something like that's somewhat prosaic, right? Scheduling.
Absolutely. I mean, if we think about kind of, having a center for teaching and learning excellence, I think we really miss an opportunity if we don't bring in those who are responsible for administering the scheduling. So I'm not talking necessarily about, associate chairs and chairs or program directors who are figuring out which courses they want to run, but actually, if you want, the back office, for want of a better term, right? Okay, those people who were charged with ensuring that we're using rooms efficiently, ensuring that everyone has a classroom and a class time, and of course also that Herculean task of ensuring that students don't have timetable clashes. These are all really important things, but I think that back end is just as important to innovation and needs to be a part of that conversation. And it's not sexy, and it's not hot, and it's not about bringing in new technologies. And I'm a big fan of flipped teaching, and that's been a hot kind of topic since way before the pandemic. But these things aren't necessarily sexy, and we don't necessarily think of them as core to teaching.
So we think about the people who are drawn to innovation are generally not the kind of people that are interested in operations. they're sort of like at the cutting edge of what's new, but that newness, that transformation can't happen unless we interrogate these past practices, and all the detail-oriented folk building the structure are really deeply committed to that structure because that's where they live. So that there's a really interesting cultural disconnect there.
Absolutely. I think every university is defined by a tension between the administration and the faculty, right? And never the two shall meet, and they'll always disagree. But I think that those most innovative members of faculty, those who really want to see changes in teaching, they miss a step if they don't look at their teaching holistically. They miss a step if they don't think, you need to think outside of the box, and a lot of people are thinking about that on the front end of teaching, about how they deliver content, how they are handling assessment, how they're giving feedback, right? But actually, you're only looking at half it. You're not reaching your full potential if you don't look at the back end as well. And you need to bring those people along. Now, that I think there is this long-standing kind of belief that it's like, well, I'll do this innovation in spite of the constraints that the administration are putting on me. But have we ever actually sat down with those folk? Have we actually sat down with associate deans and assistant deans and so on and so forth and said, what would you do if you could rip everything up and do everything differently? How would you think about scheduling? How would you think about that? And what conversation would you want to have with those people in the classroom, right? What is it that you think are the ways in which we could do things differently? Because it's very easy to kind of write operations offers. They want to keep things as simple as possible and keep it as straightforward and do things as they have been doing, and therefore think, oh, well, they're going to be quite conservative in their viewpoints. But one of the things that I think came through in the Reimagining Higher Education project, which did bring, faculty and administrators together, was that actually everyone can generate ideas. Everyone has ideas for efficiencies, and they might be really small ideas, but actually putting them together, having a conversation around that is really useful, because you can't engage with that kind of innovation unless every stakeholder who has some role in that comes to the table, and is given a voice and is also given a charge to innovate as well. We're charging faculty to innovate, but where's the kind of call on that operational side? Where's the invitation on that operational side?
This is so exciting, and I just want to kind of bring it down to a concrete level, because I think it may be hard for people listening who haven't sat with that spreadsheet of a schedule to even imagine why what you're describing would matter in a faculty member's life, right? So I'm really curious what you've seen from your colleagues, but I want to tell you a couple things that I've seen from my colleagues and my students. It used to be, Fordham's class schedule is typically, or has been for years, Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, with Wednesday a very lightly scheduled day. That was because the administration, this is what I was told, was absolutely averse to people having a 3-day weekend, right? They were absolutely did not want people to be able to skip out of town on Fridays. But the fact is that my colleagues at other institutions who are working in my area, all of our seminars and symposia are on Fridays. If I want to participate in research with local colleagues who are just a MetroCard swipe away, I can't teach on Friday because there are 3 or 4 monthly meetings on Fridays. And that enriches my intellectual life and makes me a better teacher. Similarly, I know when my students are able to arrange their schedules so that they have a day or 2 days a week that don't have classes, they can take a job and take an internship, which is essential for their professional development. It helps the faculty and it helps the students when we have these blocks of time that are not in class, whether that's because that's a day when we can meet as a group, everyone who's teaching this course. We never schedule this course on Tuesday mornings because on Tuesday mornings we have a Zoom to talk about how it's going once a month. Or that's a day when my students can take an internship, right? So I'm wondering if you have examples like that in your department, where inviting people to be innovative and intentional with setting their schedules, doubling up preps, has yielded cool results or interesting connections?
But I want to kind of zoom out for a second and take that 3-day weekend issue. I think one of the issues that we have at Fordham is that we want to be research intensive, but the way we operate is teaching focused. That's not necessarily a huge problem. There's a tension there, but it could be productive. But if we treat teaching as something that equates to being chained to your desk, then I think we have a problem there. Okay, I heaven forbid that someone had a 3-day weekend. Well, most of the faculty that I know, would use that 3-day weekend. Every now and then they might take a 3-day weekend, but most of the time they would probably actually use it so that they could actually speed up and get into research, right? There's this belief that research is something that you turn on and off like a tap. And of course it's not. Any of us know that actually, you need a bit of a run up into it and a bit, you need to come back down from it as well. So I think that there is also this kind of real issue between faculty research and operations around teaching. But putting that aside, increasingly, and this is something that I've we've done at a previous institution that I've worked at, is not thinking about section. You've got sections of a class, for instance, and trying very, very hard to think about that as an entire class. So yes, you will meet with your back in the UK it would be your seminar leader or someone and so forth and that. But for discussions. But some of the core content that was being delivered by one person each week, and that rotated round, and that filled up one of the content sections, right? Okay, so you would have 75 minutes, and that would be everyone together in a lecture theatre, or it would be an asynchronous lecture, or whatever it might be, that they were delivering content for that entire class, right? And then you have a 75-minute discussion, and it's much more focused. The questions have already been set in the lecture. The students have prepared for it, so on and so forth. Now, at Fordham, we haven't had that flexibility, but the pandemic started to create some of that because there just wasn't the same sort of physical structure, that kind of literally tied us to
Right.
space.
One of the things that hampers that possibility of a large lecture with multiple sections is just architecture, right?
Absolutely.
Our Lincoln Center campus doesn't have lecture halls. So
Yeah.
we could get as excited as we wanted to get about large multi-section lectures, but if we're tied to classrooms, the architecture of Midtown prevents, like, oh, it'd be cool to meet once a week as 200 and then once a week in sections of 20.
Yeah.
We don't have the architecture for that.
We don't have the architecture physically, which comes to that next point of expanding our understanding around what teaching is, right? A journalist friend of mine, I was talking to her many years ago, well, I say many years ago, but maybe 10 years ago. And she says, the big thing that's changed is she worked for the BBC, she says, I no longer think about stories. I think about content. I was taught as a journalist initially, she said, to write a story and that's going into print. And then you write a story and that's going into TV. And you write a story and that's going into to radio. She says, you can't think about it like that anymore. Okay, we're multi-platform. Okay, content is content. Focus on the content. Okay, the delivery is kind of secondary in some respects. And yes, you have to tailor and so on and so forth. But I think we need to take the same approach to teaching, which is, what's the learning outcomes? How am I going to reach those learning outcomes? What's the content of this? The delivery, whether it be on Zoom or something, yes, there are techniques that you need to use on Zoom, to keep attention, to maintain things, so on and so forth. But we learned to do that in the pandemic. And it's not as though you just walk into a classroom without any kind of skills and techniques that you have to use, right? Like I fully understand, I'm a realist. I understand that we need, butts on seats, or rather actually we need bodies in beds, at each university that has any kind of residential element, right? Okay, we have a bill to pay there, or multiple bills to pay. I get that. I also think it's really important that students can see one another face to face, can meet with their instructor face to face, can have that kind of interaction. But I think that actually meeting once a week for a fantastic class, with 20 other students and an instructor, I think that's just as valuable as meeting twice a week in that class. But in one of those classes, it's more of a lecture format. So I'd say let's focus on delivering the content asynchronously, perhaps, or even synchronously but remotely. Okay, that allows us to cope with the numbers, right? The architecture is definitely an issue, but the architecture is already out of date as soon as it's built in many respects. We build these things and student numbers go up, right? It's like motorways. This is what happens. Sorry, freeways. This is what happens here. But we have this amazing opportunity. We've learned so much about how to do remote teaching. And I think some of the best teaching that I had during the pandemic was where I had an asynchronous lecture that had loads of interactive elements. Pause this now. I need you to go to YouTube and find me an example of Laura Mulvey's male gaze in action in a film, or pause this. I need you to go and examine this particular site. Is it a counterpublic or is it a digital enclave? Right? Then come back and so on and so forth. That then allowed me to have a 75-minute class with half of my students, because I taught half online and half in person, because some students need to be on campus, socially distanced, so on and so forth. That allowed me to have 75 minutes, and we got straight into the discussion. There didn't even need to be a setup, right? It's like I'd already given them the questions at the end of the lecture for them to think about. We came in and they're like, right, okay, I want to talk about this. I found this example, so on and so forth. The richness of that discussion, that beats for me any kind of need to meet twice a week, and I understand middle states accreditation, so on and so forth. But I do think that we have a real opportunity here to work more closely with our students by refashioning how we deliver some of that content that they need to know in order for us to get to the really important discussions.
Being able to articulate, like, oh, it's the unscripted nature of group work that makes me nervous, or I don't like standing up in front of a larger group. I mean, typically that's the more nerve-wracking thing for people, but not everyone is that way. But when you have a variety of educational experiences, then students can begin to identify, like, oh, I learn really well when we get 2 minutes of silence to collect our thoughts before we open it out for discussion.
I remember going to a research talk, actually, and it's a standard kind of research paper being given. It was like 35, 40 minutes or something like that. And when I walked in, the room had been organized as a kind of, I suppose, a classroom, but it was clusters of tables and chairs gathered around tables, but in different groups and so on and so forth. And I just didn't think anything of it and sat down. And as soon as the research paper was over, the person who was chairing it, turned around and said, okay, so we sat like this, and that's for a reason. Let's just take 4 or 5 minutes, to reflect on that paper, and what did you take away from it, and whatever and stuff, before we start the questions. And at first I was like, oh my God, this felt very forced and strange and so on and so forth. Do you know what? We had one of the best discussions ever, because people were able to rehearse. And I guess the thing that I'm saying is that this is not just a student thing, right? Faculty need it as well. You go to the conference and they take 5 minutes to ask a question that's actually more of a comment or something. That rehearsing, right? That opportunity to be a little backstage and to play with ideas and talk things through actually is really, I think, very useful. And I think that creating spaces where that can happen in the classroom, but perhaps also outside of the classroom as well. One thing that I did in the pandemic, we had loads of class spaces available, but I wanted students to be able to talk. And so I was putting them in, I actually had the luxury of being able to put them into different classrooms, to do that work, and I could go around and see them. And that was great. But obviously we don't have that quite so much now. But
I mean, I team taught a class once. It was really, really, really hard. Talk about back-end negotiations.
Yeah.
Incredibly difficult to be allowed to teach a class. And then I got them to reserve 2 classrooms for us adjacent to each other. And so we had 40 students, 2 professors, same course, same number, same section, 2 rooms. And so we could split up and go into different rooms on different days. And it was so exciting to be able to say, okay, today you're going to benefit from his expertise and he's going to give you a lecture. And the other half of you are going to be working on writing pedagogy with Anne. And then we're going to flip that the other day of the week. And so we had this smaller group thing. And then we are going to come all back together for a couple more sections. And that took so much administrative work, but it was such an exciting teaching experiment.
And it comes back to my point about bringing the administrators into the conversation around innovation. What would happen if we stopped thinking about a 2-3 and instead started talking about the number of hours someone delivers, right, in terms of teaching? How might that open spaces where we look at a course not as being taught, twice a week by this one instructor, but actually this course requires this number of hours, and Anne is going to teach this number of hours on the course, and Steve will teach this number of hours, and Sharif will teach this number of hours, right? What might that look like? Because we would still be delivering the same amount of teaching, I think, but it would also allow us a flexibility to play to our strengths. Steve may well be far better at teaching writing than I am, and I might well, be better at talking post-structuralist queer theory than Anne is, or something, though I probably am not. But you see what I mean is that we can play to our strengths. Okay, we can divide that up. They also get an experience with 3 different instructors, and I think that's also the other thing that Fordham could really benefit from. I think we have some great faculty, but I think students should have an experience of a range of different faculty, and that shouldn't necessarily be per one member of faculty per course, but actually mixing that up and through, because you get different people's perspectives, right? I might think Foucault, I happen to think Foucault is fantastic, but Steve might be, actually here's my critique of this, right? Okay, so but if they're in taking that class with me, they're not getting Steve's critique of that. They're getting my perspective. So I really like the idea that if there was one magic wish that I could have at Fordham, it would be that we stop thinking of teaching as in a 2-3, and instead think of it as this is the number of hours that you need to teach. The other really nice thing about that is it allows for far greater flexibility. We don't even need to talk about course releases anymore. We might start talking about service work in relation to hours as well. And so actually, you might not get a course release for doing this larger piece of work. And let's face it, we're all administrators at some level, especially those on the tenure track. But actually, you might get a slight reduction in your hours for that semester. Okay, so-and-so is taking on that particular project, and therefore actually that's going to count as 15 hours of teaching time or something like that, That's, I've worked under that model before. The level of flexibility that gave department chairs and individual faculty in order to be able to shape a timetable that, 1, delivered content to students in a really effective way, but 2, also created time for research and also to do service properly.
When you introduce students to a variety of professors early on, and they have, say, 20% of their course is taught by one instructor and 20% by another, students can learn the range of theoretical approaches, pedagogical approaches. You can, in a faculty that's not as diverse as it ought to be, introduce students to faculty members of color and have students see how we respect and esteem faculty members who may be otherwise underrepresented on the faculty.
The argument for that, Anne, becomes even more powerful when we recognize that we now have a new central advising service, which I think has the potential to be great, but where faculty are now moving from an advisory role to a mentoring role. How do you know who you want to contact as a mentor if you haven't met them? If professors are teaching 4,000 level classes, well, how is a student in their first year ever going to know about that? This offers them the opportunity. Your 1,000 class might be a boot camp, but it's also an introduction to the department, right? And I think that this is a real opportunity to then set up mentoring, to introduce and showcase faculty and their interests and their styles and their perspectives and their identities, so that students know that, okay, I remember having a lecture with them. They were great. I might go and speak to them about X or Y or Z.
Sharif, we always end every episode by asking people to tell us about a teacher who's meant a lot to them. So I'm wondering who you'd like to talk about.
Goodness me. I feel like I'm on a knife edge, because if you ever heard it and I didn't say the person that I think I should say, then you'd be very upset. But no, I will say, it's my old advisor, my PhD advisor, Andy Medhurst. He's now retired. I did my PhD in the UK, but I admired him during my PhD. But it was actually during my master's where I first got to know him properly. And he teaches cultural studies, and I lived for my classes with him during my master's. I took a class with him, and it was on queering popular culture, and it's kind of a famous class for anyone who's taken that particular degree pathway, because every week that we were doing, so he would get us to we would do show and tell, we would do kind of a crazy number of different sort of ideas where people, he didn't just want you to read the reading. You had to go out and find objects. You had to bring things in. You had to go and have an experience one week and come back. You had to, when he was teaching the Carnivalesque, it was like, right, okay, go and have a Carnivalesque experience. Don't break the law, don't get yourself in hospital. But what might that look like? And it was the embodiment of the teaching. Right, it was the doing of the learning that really inspired me to pursue teaching, and really turned me on to teaching. And he always said, you don't just walk in to teach, you perform. Right, if I ever had him do a guest lecture, he said, give me my 5-minute call, I'll make sure that I'm ready and whatever. But it was, teaching is a performance, and you have to bring a certain self to it. And that's not, being, the arrogant, pompous know-it-all or whatever. But you are performing to these people, and so you've got to have some kind of charisma and character there and whatever. You should walk out of a lecture theatre feeling a little bit exhausted from having done it, And yes, maybe that's the camp element inside of me. But I would say, Andy Medhurst, is a very dear friend of mine now, but he will always be, and I think for many people who were taught by the professor that they remember.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful. The doing of teaching. I love it. And
Yeah.
Steve always talks about the character of Professor D'Agostino, right? So we've talked about that idea a lot of who we are with our students as like ourselves, but a better version of ourselves and a focused version of ourselves that's about performing the doing of learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was terrific. Thank
you so much.
much.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Twiceover Podcast is available on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify, with new episodes appearing each week. For host and guest bios and show notes, please visit our website, twiceoverpodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter at twiceover1 and email us at twiceoverpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.